The sun had bled its last crimson drops across the horizon when Cole heard it, a sound that cut through the evening stillness like a knife through silence. At first he thought it might be a wounded animal, maybe a coyote caught in a trap. But as he guided his weathered horse closer to the abandoned Baxter ranch, the sound became unmistakably human. A child's cry, weak and desperate. Cole had been riding this same trail for 3 years now, ever since he'd settled in the dying prairie town of Millbrook. At 43, he'd grown accustomed to solitude, preferring the company of his horse and the vast emptiness of the plains to the suspicious glances and whispered conversations that followed him wherever he went. People in small towns had long memories, and Cole's past wasn't the kind that earned him invitations to Sunday dinners. The crying grew louder as he dismounted near the rotting fence posts that marked what used to be the Baxter property. Old man Baxter had died 2 winters ago, leaving behind nothing but debts and a ranch that nobody wanted to buy. The place had become a haven for drifters and outlaws passing through, which was exactly why Cole avoided it after dark. But tonight was different. Tonight, something was pulling him forward against every instinct that told him to ride away. Behind the main house, partially hidden by overgrown weeds and fallen timber, Cole saw a sight that stopped his heart cold. A small figure, no bigger than a rag doll, was tied to a splintered fence post. The child couldn't have been more than 2 years old, his tiny frame shaking with exhaustion and fear. Dirt and tears had created muddy streaks down his cheeks, and his clothes, what little remained of them, hung in tatters. "Jesus Christ," Cole whispered, dropping to his knees beside the boy. His hands trembled as he worked to untie the rough rope that bound the child's wrists. The knots were tight, cruel, tied by someone who had no intention of this boy ever getting free. The toddler looked up at him with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. Eyes that had seen things no child should ever witness. When Cole finally freed him, the boy didn't run or cry out. Instead, he clutched something tightly in his small fist, a tattered handkerchief with delicate embroidery that spelled out a single letter. "M. Where's your mama, little one?" Cole asked softly, though he knew the child was too young to answer. The boy just stared at him, those haunting eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and terror. Cole had seen plenty of cruelty in his 43 years. He'd witnessed men kill for a handful of coins and watched families torn apart by greed and violence. But this was something that reached into the deepest, darkest corners of his soul and twisted everything he thought he knew about human nature. As he lifted the child into his arms, memories of his own childhood came flooding back. He remembered being 8 years old, hiding in a root cellar while his father's creditors ransacked their home. He remembered the hunger, the cold, the overwhelming sense of abandonment that had shaped every decision he'd made since. This boy would not suffer the same fate, not if Cole had anything to say about it. The ride back to his cabin seemed to take forever. The child had fallen asleep against his chest, exhausted from whatever ordeal had brought him to that fence post. Cole could feel the boy's ribs through his thin shirt, could see the signs of prolonged hunger and neglect. Whoever had done this had been planning it for some time. Cole's cabin sat on a small piece of land he'd bought with money earned from odd jobs and the occasional bounty. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a stone fireplace, but it was honest work that had paid for it, and it was the first place he'd ever been able to call home. Inside, he laid the boy on his own bed and began the delicate process of cleaning him up. The child woke several times during the process, each time gripping that embroidered handkerchief tighter, as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the world. "M," Cole said quietly, studying the careful stitching. "That's your mama's initial, isn't it?" The boy's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time, Cole saw something other than fear in them. Recognition. Hope. Cole warmed some milk over the fire and tried to coax the child to drink. It took patience. The boy was clearly traumatized and suspicious of any kindness, but eventually he managed to get some nourishment into him. As the night wore on, Cole found himself humming old lullabies his own mother had sung to him before she died, songs he hadn't thought about in decades. By morning, word of Cole's discovery had somehow reached town. He wasn't surprised. Secrets had a way of traveling fast in places like Millbrook, especially when they involved the local outcast. What did surprise him was how quickly the accusations started flying. Sheriff Morrison arrived just after sunrise, his face grim and his hand resting on his gun belt. Behind him stood Mayor Hutchins and Doc Bradley, both men Cole recognized but had never spoken to directly. "Cole," the sheriff said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and suspicion, "we heard you found yourself a child last night." "Found him tied to a post out at the old Baxter place," Cole replied, stepping protectively in front of his cabin door. "Someone left him there to die." "That's a serious accusation," Mayor Hutchins interjected. "You got any proof of that?" Cole's jaw tightened. "The rope burns on his wrists are proof enough. The fact that he was half-starved and scared out of his mind is proof enough. Could be you put those rope burns there yourself," Sheriff Morrison said quietly. "Could be you're the one who's been keeping this child, and now you're trying to cover your tracks." The accusation hit Cole like a physical blow. He'd expected suspicion. It followed him everywhere. But this was different. This was about an innocent child, and the implication that he could harm something so helpless made his blood boil. "You know me better than that, Morrison," Cole said, his voice dangerously low. "Do I?" the sheriff replied. "All I know is that you're a man with a past you don't talk about, living alone out here with no family, no friends, no ties to this community. And now suddenly you've got a child that nobody's claimed." Doc Bradley stepped forward, his medical bag in hand. "Let me examine the boy, Cole. If what you're saying is true, there'll be evidence." Cole hesitated. He'd grown attached to the child in just one night, felt a protective instinct he hadn't experienced since, well, since never. The thought of handing him over to these men, even temporarily, made every muscle in his body tense. But he also knew that refusing would only make him look more guilty. Reluctantly, he stepped aside and allowed the doctor to enter his cabin. The examination took 20 minutes. When Doc Bradley emerged, his face was pale and his hands were shaking slightly. "Rope burns, just like Cole said," the doctor announced. "Recent ones, and signs of prolonged malnutrition and dehydration. This child has been through hell." Sheriff Morrison's expression softened slightly, but his hand remained on his gun. "That still doesn't explain how Cole happened to find him, or why he didn't bring him to town immediately." "Because I knew this would happen," Cole said, gesturing to the small crowd that had gathered. "I knew you'd all assume the worst about me, just like you always do. The boy needs proper care," Mayor Hutchins said. "Medical attention, a proper family. You can't provide that, Cole." "I can provide safety," Cole replied firmly. "I can provide someone who gives a damn about what happens to him." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, if not for the arrival of a new voice, one that changed everything. "That's my boy." Everyone turned to see a man stumbling toward them, his clothes torn and bloody, his face bearing the unmistakable signs of recent violence. He was tall and lean, with the calloused hands of a working man, and eyes that held the same haunted quality as the child's. "That's my son," the man repeated, his voice breaking. "His name is Tommy Garrett." Sheriff Morrison drew his gun. "And who might you be?" "Frank Garrett," the man replied, swaying on his feet. "I worked for the Hendricks Ranch. That's my boy you found." Cole felt the world shift beneath his feet. After a night of bonding with the child, of feeling something he'd thought was dead inside him come back to life, the reality of the situation hit him like a sledgehammer. This wasn't his child to protect. This wasn't his chance at redemption. But as Frank Garrett collapsed to his knees, blood seeping through his shirt, Cole realized that the story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Frank Garrett's collapse sent the small crowd into chaos. Doc Bradley immediately rushed to his side, while Sheriff Morrison kept his gun trained on the wounded man, unsure whether he was looking at a victim or a perpetrator. Don't let them take him," Frank gasped, his eyes fixed on Cole. "They'll kill him. Kill us all." "Who?" Cole demanded, kneeling beside the injured man. "Who's trying to kill you?" But Frank had lost consciousness, blood pooling beneath him in the morning dust. Doc Bradley worked frantically to stabilize him while Mayor Hutchins paced nervously, clearly out of his depth. "We need to get him to my office," the doctor said. "He's lost a lot of blood, and there's something lodged in his shoulder. Looks like a bullet fragment." As they prepared to move Frank, Cole noticed something that made his blood run cold. The man's left hand bore the same rope burns as his son's wrists. Whatever had happened to little Tommy, his father had tried to prevent it, and had paid a terrible price. "Sheriff," Cole said quietly, "this man didn't abandon his child. Someone took the boy from him." Morrison's expression remained skeptical. "That's a hell of an assumption, Cole. Look at his hands. Look at the wounds. This man fought for his son." The sheriff examined Frank's injuries more closely, and Cole saw doubt creep into his eyes. The rope burns, the defensive wounds on his arms, the bullet fragment, it all painted a picture of a man who had been overpowered, not one who had willingly given up his child. "All right," Morrison said finally. "We'll take him to Doc's place and see what he has to say when he wakes up. But the boy stays in town until we sort this out." "No." The word came out of Cole's mouth before he could stop it. "The boy stays with me." "Cole, think about it, Sheriff. If someone was willing to shoot this man and tie his child to a fence post, what makes you think they won't try again? At least out here I can see them coming." It was a weak argument, and everyone knew it. But there was something in Cole's voice, a conviction that surprised even him, that gave Morrison pause. 24 hours, the sheriff said finally. "You keep the boy for 24 hours while we figure out what happened. But if I don't like what I hear from Frank Garrett, I'm coming back with a warrant." As the crowd dispersed, Cole found himself alone with Tommy once again. The child had slept through most of the commotion, exhausted from his ordeal, but now he was awake and looking around with those two knowing eyes. "Your daddy's hurt, little man," Cole said softly, "but he's going to be okay. Doc Bradley's taking good care of him." Tommy clutched his embroidered handkerchief tighter, and Cole noticed for the first time that there were other letters stitched into the fabric, faded and worn, but still visible. M-A-R-Y. "Mary," Cole whispered. "That's your mama's name, isn't it?" The boy's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. His face crumpled and he began to cry, not the desperate wails of the night before, but the quiet, hopeless sobs of a child who had lost everything. Cole spent the rest of the morning trying to comfort Tommy while his mind raced with questions. Where was Mary Garrett? Why had Frank been shot? And who was powerful enough to make a man abandon his family in the middle of nowhere? The answers began to come that afternoon when Cole decided to do some investigating of his own. Leaving Tommy in the care of Mrs. Patterson, the only person in town who had shown any kindness toward Cole, he rode out to the Hendricks Ranch where Frank supposedly worked. What he found there only deepened the mystery. The ranch was in chaos. Cattle were scattered across the range, fences were down, and the main house showed signs of recent violence. Broken windows, overturned furniture, and bloodstains on the front porch. "Hello?" Cole called out, his hand resting on his gun. "Anyone here?" A voice answered from the barn, weak, frightened, but unmistakably female. "Help! Please!" Cole found her in one of the stalls, bound and gagged, her clothes torn and her face bruised. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair and eyes that held the same desperate quality he'd seen in Tommy's face. "Mary?" he asked as he cut her bonds. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Tommy? Where's Tommy? They said they'd kill him if Frank didn't—" "He's safe," Cole assured her. "Your husband found me. He's hurt, but he's alive." The relief that washed over Mary's face was profound, but it was quickly replaced by terror. "We have to get out of here," she said, struggling to stand. "They'll be back soon. They always come back." "Who? Who's doing this to you?" "Silas Crenshaw," she whispered, the name carrying the weight of a curse. "He says Frank owes him money, but it's not true. Frank never borrowed anything from him. Crenshaw just wants our land. The water rights." Cole knew the name. Silas Crenshaw was a loan shark and land grabber who operated out of the county seat, using violence and intimidation to build his empire. If Crenshaw was involved, it explained everything. The desperation, the violence, the willingness to use a child as leverage. "How long has this been going on?" Cole asked as he helped Mary toward his horse. 3 months, she replied. "Ever since Frank inherited his father's property. Crenshaw showed up with papers claiming Frank owed him $5,000. Money his father supposedly borrowed before he died. But Frank's father never borrowed money from anyone. He was too proud. Did you go to the sheriff?" Mary's laugh was bitter. "Sheriff Morrison won't cross Crenshaw. Nobody will. He owns half the county, and the other half is too scared to stand up to him." As they rode back toward town, Mary told Cole the rest of the story. Crenshaw had given Frank 30 days to pay the alleged debt. When Frank couldn't produce money he didn't owe, Crenshaw's men had attacked the ranch. Frank had managed to get Mary and Tommy away, but they'd been pursued. In the chaos, Tommy had been captured. "Frank tried to trade himself for Tommy," Mary said, her voice breaking. "But Crenshaw's men just laughed. They said they'd keep the boy as insurance, make sure Frank didn't try to run or go to the law. So Frank came looking for his son, and found him tied to that fence post like an animal." Mary's voice was filled with rage and heartbreak. "What kind of monsters do that to a baby?" Cole didn't answer, but he knew exactly what kind of monsters they were dealing with. He'd encountered men like Crenshaw before, men who saw other people as nothing more than obstacles to be removed or tools to be used. The fact that they'd been willing to use a toddler as leverage told him everything he needed to know about their character. By the time they reached town, the sun was setting, and Cole could see smoke rising from the chimney of Doc Bradley's office. Frank was awake, and according to Mrs. Patterson, he'd been asking for his wife and son non-stop. The reunion was everything Cole had hoped it would be, and everything he'd feared it would cost him. Watching Mary and Frank hold their son, seeing the pure joy and relief on their faces, Cole felt a happiness that was almost painful in its intensity. This was what family looked like. This was what love looked like. And it was something he would never have. But as the Garrett family clung to each other in Doc Bradley's office, Cole noticed something that chilled him to the bone. Through the window, he could see riders approaching town. 6 men in dark coats, moving with the purposeful stride of those who had come to finish what they'd started. Silas Crenshaw had arrived to collect his debt. The riders came like harbingers of death, their horses' hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth as they rode down Millbrook's main street. Cole recognized the type immediately. Hired guns with cold eyes and steady hands. Men who killed for money and slept soundly afterward. Leading them was a figure Cole had heard described but never seen. Silas Crenshaw himself. Tall and lean, with silver hair and a face that might have been handsome, if not for the cruelty that twisted his features, Crenshaw carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. "Doc," Cole said quietly, moving to the window of the medical office. "You might want to keep the Garretts in the back room." "Doctor." Bradley looked up from checking Frank's bandages, saw the riders, and immediately understood. "Mary, take Tommy and Frank into the supply room. Don't come out until I tell you." But Frank struggled to sit up, his face pale but determined. "No, I won't hide from him anymore." "Frank," Mary began. "He's got my son once," Frank said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I'll die before I let him take Tommy again." Cole admired the man's courage, but courage without strategy was just another word for suicide. "Frank, you're in no condition to fight. Let me handle this." "This isn't your fight, Cole. It became my fight the moment I found your boy tied to that fence post." The truth was, Cole had been looking for a fight like this his entire life. A fight where the lines were clearly drawn, where he could stand on the side of right without question or doubt. For too long, he'd been running from his past, from the violence that seemed to follow him wherever he went. But this time, the violence had a purpose. Sheriff Morrison appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "Crenshaw's here," he announced unnecessarily. "He's asking about the Garrett family." "And what did you tell him?" Cole asked. Morrison's silence was answer enough. The sheriff was a decent man, but he was also a practical one. He wouldn't stand against Crenshaw without overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing, and even then he'd think twice. "I told him I'd look into it," Morrison said finally. "But Cole, you need to understand, Crenshaw's got legal papers. As far as the law's concerned, Frank owes him money." "Forged papers," Mary said from the doorway, ignoring her husband's attempts to keep her hidden. "Those documents are fake, and everyone knows it." "Knowing it and proving it are two different things," Morrison replied. "And until someone can prove those papers are forged, my hands are tied." Cole felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same anger that had driven him to leave his last town, and the one before that. But this time, he forced himself to think clearly. Crenshaw was smart. He wouldn't have come to town without a plan. The question was, what did he really want? The answer came sooner than expected. Crenshaw himself appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 of his men. Up close, he was even more intimidating, not because of his size, but because of the absolute confidence in his bearing. This was a man who had never lost, and he knew it. "Sheriff Morrison," Crenshaw said, his voice cultured and polite, "I understand you've recovered some stolen property of mine." "I'm not sure what you mean." Morrison replied carefully. Crenshaw's eyes found Frank, then moved to Mary and Tommy. The Garrett family. They've been hiding from their legal obligations, Sheriff. I have a court order demanding payment of a legitimate debt, and when they couldn't pay, they fled in the night. That's a lie, Frank said, struggling to his feet despite his injuries. I never borrowed money from you, Crenshaw. My father never borrowed money from you. Your father was a gambling man, Frank, Crenshaw replied smoothly. Perhaps he didn't share all his business dealings with you. Cole watched the exchange with growing understanding. Crenshaw wasn't just here for money. He was here for the land. The Garrett property sat on one of the few reliable water sources in the county, and in a drought year like this one, water was worth more than gold. What's the real game here, Crenshaw? Cole asked, stepping forward. Because we both know this isn't about a debt. Crenshaw's attention shifted to Cole, and for the first time, his composure slipped slightly. And you are? Someone who doesn't like seeing children used as leverage. Ah, yes, the mysterious Mr. Cole. I've heard about you. Crenshaw's smile was cold. A man with a violent past, living alone, no family, no ties to this community. Some might wonder what your interest is in the Garrett family. The implication was clear, and Cole felt his temper flare. But before he could respond, little Tommy broke free from his mother's arms and ran straight to Cole, wrapping his tiny arms around the cowboy's legs. The gesture was simple, innocent, and devastating. In that moment, everyone in the room could see the bond that had formed between the lonely cowboy and the traumatized child. It was pure, uncomplicated, and absolutely genuine. Crenshaw's expression darkened. Touching, he said, but irrelevant. I have legal papers, Sheriff. I want what's owed to me. And if they can't pay, Morrison asked, then I'll take the land in compensation. It's all perfectly legal. Over my dead body, Frank said. Crenshaw's smile returned. That can be arranged. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Cole felt Tommy's grip tighten on his legs, felt the child's fear radiating through the small room. This had gone far enough. There's another option, Cole said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. What kind of option? Crenshaw asked. A contest. You and me. Winner takes all. Crenshaw laughed. What are you, 12 years old? This is the real world, not some dime novel. You're right, Cole agreed. In the real world, men like you hide behind hired guns and forged papers. But sometimes, just sometimes, someone calls your bluff. The insult hit its mark. Cole could see Crenshaw's jaw tighten, could see the anger building behind his eyes. Men like Crenshaw had one weakness, their pride. They couldn't stand to be challenged, especially in public. What did you have in mind? Crenshaw asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Simple. You and me, tomorrow at dawn. Guns. If I win, you tear up those papers and leave the Garretts alone. If you win, you get the land, and I'll throw in my property as a bonus. Cole, no, Mary whispered. You don't understand what you're up against. But Cole did understand. He understood that Crenshaw was a bully who had never faced real opposition. He understood that men like him were cowards at heart, used to winning through intimidation rather than skill. And he understood that sometimes the only way to stop a monster was to become something more dangerous. Interesting proposition, Crenshaw said. But why would I risk everything on a gunfight when I can simply take what I want through legal means? Because you're curious, Cole replied. You want to know if the stories about me are true. You want to know if the man who cleaned out the Dalton gang single-handed is still as fast as they say. The room went dead silent. Cole had never spoken about his past in Millbrook, had never given anyone reason to connect him with the events that had made him famous and infamous across 3 states. But now, with Tommy's life hanging in the balance, he was willing to use that reputation. Crenshaw's eyes widened slightly. "You're that Cole. Cole Brennan." "I'm that Cole," he confirmed. "And I'm making you an offer. Take it, or spend the rest of your life wondering if you were fast enough." The challenge was irresistible, and they both knew it. Crenshaw had built his reputation on being the most dangerous man in the county. The chance to prove himself against a genuine legend was too tempting to pass up. "Dawn," Crenshaw said finally. "Main Street. And when I kill you, I'm taking the Garrett land and everything else you own." "Fair enough," Cole replied. "But when I kill you, your men ride out of here and never come back." Crenshaw nodded curtly and turned to leave, his men following. But at the doorway, he paused. "You know, Brennan, I've always wondered what happened to you after the Dalton business. Some said you'd gone soft, living the quiet life. I guess we'll find out tomorrow," Cole said. After Crenshaw left, the room erupted in voices. Morrison warning Cole about the legal ramifications, Doc Bradley questioning his sanity, Mary begging him to reconsider. But through it all, Cole was aware of only one thing: Tommy's small hand slipping into his, trusting and warm. That night, as Cole sat by his fireplace cleaning his guns, Frank Garrett appeared at his door. The injured man moved slowly, but his eyes were clear and determined. "I can't let you do this," Frank said. "This is my fight." "You're in no condition to fight anyone," Cole replied. "Besides, I've been looking for a reason to use these guns for something good. Might as well be now." "Why?" Frank asked. "Why risk your life for people you barely know?" Cole was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. "Because that boy deserves a chance to grow up with his family, because his mother deserves to sleep without fear, and because sometimes a man has to stand up for what's right, even if it costs him everything." "And if you lose?" Cole smiled grimly. "Then I guess I'll finally get some peace." But as he said the words, Cole realized they weren't true anymore. For the first time in years, he didn't want peace. He wanted to live. He wanted to see Tommy grow up, wanted to help rebuild the family that had been torn apart by greed and violence. He wanted a chance at redemption. Tomorrow, at dawn, he would either claim that chance or die trying. The morning mist clung to Millbrook's main street like the breath of ghosts, swirling around the wooden storefronts and hitching posts as the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon. Cole stood at the far end of the street, his long coat hanging open to reveal the twin Colts at his hips, weapons that had made him famous and infamous in equal measure. At the opposite end, Silas Crenshaw waited with the patience of a predator. He'd shed his expensive coat for a simple black vest, and his gun belt sat low on his hips in the manner of a man who knew how to use it. Between them stretched 50 yards of packed earth that would soon be stained with blood. The entire town had turned out to witness the confrontation. They lined the boardwalks and peered from windows, drawn by the same morbid fascination that made men slow their horses to stare at roadside graves. Sheriff Morrison stood to one side, his hand resting on his gun, ready to intervene if the fight spilled over into something larger. But Cole's attention was focused on a small group standing in front of Doc Bradley's office. Frank Garrett, pale but upright, had his arm around his wife Mary. Between them stood little Tommy, clutching his embroidered handkerchief and staring at Cole with those two knowing eyes. The boy raised his small hand in a tentative wave, and Cole felt something shift inside his chest. For 43 years, he'd lived for himself alone, making decisions based on survival and self-interest. But now, for the first time, he had something worth dying for. "You ready, Brennan?" Crenshaw called out, his voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. "Been ready for 20 years," Cole replied. The rules were simple, established by generations of men who had settled their differences with lead and powder. They would walk toward each other until one of them decided the distance was right, then draw and fire. The last man standing would be the winner, and the dead would have no say in what came after. They began walking. Cole's mind was calm, focused, his breathing steady and controlled. This was what he'd been born for. Not the killing, but the moment of absolute clarity that came just before violence erupted. Time seemed to slow, and he became aware of everything. The creak of leather, the whisper of wind through the buildings, the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. 30 yards, 25, 20. Crenshaw was good. Cole could see it in the way he moved, the confidence in his stride. This wasn't a man who had built his reputation on luck or intimidation alone. He was a genuine gunfighter, fast and accurate, with the kind of cold nerve that kept a man alive in a profession where most died young. 15 yards. 10. Cole could see Crenshaw's eyes now, could read the calculation there. The man was waiting for the perfect moment, the instant when distance and angle and opportunity all aligned. He was a professional, and professionals didn't take unnecessary risks. But Cole wasn't a professional anymore. He was something more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. 8 yards. Crenshaw's hand moved first, a blur of motion that would have been impressive under any other circumstances. His gun cleared leather cleanly, the barrel coming up in a smooth arc that spoke of countless hours of practice. But Cole was faster. His draw was a thing of beauty and terror, honed by years of necessity and perfected by natural talent. The Colt seemed to appear in his hand as if by magic, and his first shot thundered across the street before Crenshaw's gun had fully cleared its holster. The bullet took Crenshaw high in the chest, spinning him around and sending his unfired weapon flying into the dust. He staggered, tried to stay upright, then collapsed to his knees with blood spreading across his white shirt. Cole walked toward him, his gun still drawn, ready to fire again if necessary. But as he got closer, he could see that it wouldn't be needed. Crenshaw's eyes were already glazing over, his breathing shallow and labored. "The papers," Cole said quietly. "Where are the real papers?" Crenshaw coughed, blood speckling his lips. "Safe, in my office, along with a dozen others just like them. And your men? We'll scatter, like rats when they hear I'm dead. No loyalty, without money to pay for it." Cole knelt beside the dying man. "Why the Garretts? Why their land?" Crenshaw's laugh was a wet, rattling sound. "Water rights, worth a fortune when the railroad comes through. Frank's father knew it too. That's why he never would sell. So you forged the debt papers. Easiest way to take what I wanted. Would have worked too, if not for you." Crenshaw's eyes focused on Cole with effort. "Who are you really, Brennan? What made you care about strangers?" Cole thought about the question as Crenshaw's breathing grew more labored. What had made him care? Was it Tommy's innocent trust, Mary's desperate courage, Frank's willingness to sacrifice everything for his family? Or was it something simpler? The recognition that he'd spent his entire life running from connection, from responsibility, from the possibility of being hurt again. Maybe caring about the Garretts wasn't about them at all. Maybe it was about, finally, admitting that a life lived in isolation wasn't really living at all. "I guess I got tired of being alone," Cole said finally. But Crenshaw was beyond hearing. His eyes had closed, and his breathing had stopped, leaving only the morning wind to disturb the silence. Cole stood slowly, holstering his gun, and turned to face the crowd that had gathered. Some faces showed relief, others fear, and a few displayed the kind of calculating look that suggested they were already wondering how to profit from Crenshaw's death. But the only faces that mattered were the three standing in front of Doc Bradley's office. Frank and Mary were holding each other, tears streaming down their faces, while Tommy had broken free and was running toward Cole as fast as his little legs could carry him. Cole caught the boy in his arms, lifting him high and spinning him around as Tommy laughed with pure, uncomplicated joy. It was a sound that cut through the morning air like sunlight through clouds, washing away the darkness of violence and death. "Is it over?" Mary asked as she and Frank approached. "Are we really safe?" "It's over," Cole confirmed. "Crenshaw's men will be long gone by noon, and without him backing them up, those forged papers aren't worth the ink they're printed on." Sheriff Morrison approached, his expression unreadable. "That was some shooting, Cole. Clean and legal, no question about it. But I have to ask, what happens now?" Cole looked down at Tommy, who was still clinging to him with absolute trust. Then at Frank and Mary, who were looking at him with something that might have been hope. "Now we go home," Cole said simply. The ride back to Cole's cabin was different from any journey he'd ever taken. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't traveling alone. Frank rode beside him despite his injuries, while Mary held Tommy in front of her on her horse. They talked as they rode, about the ranch they would rebuild, about the life they would create, about the future that had seemed impossible just hours before. "What will you do now?" Mary asked as they approached Cole's property. "Will you stay in Millbrook?" Cole had been thinking about that question all morning. His cabin suddenly seemed small and empty, a place built for solitude rather than connection. But the Garrett Ranch, once it was rebuilt, would need help. There would be cattle to tend, fences to mend, and 1,000 other tasks that required strong backs and willing hands. "I was thinking," Cole said carefully, "that you folks might need a partner, someone to help get the ranch back on its feet." Frank's face lit up. "You mean it? You'd want to work with us?" "I mean it," Cole replied. "If you'll have me." The answer came not from Frank or Mary, but from Tommy, who reached out from his mother's arms and grabbed Cole's hand with both of his tiny ones. "Cole, stay," the boy said clearly, the first words anyone had heard him speak. "Cole, stay." And in that moment, Cole understood that he'd found something he'd been searching for his entire life without even knowing it. Not just a family, but a place to belong. Not just a home, but a reason to build one. 3 months later, the Garrett Ranch was thriving again. The main house had been rebuilt, the fences repaired, and the cattle were growing fat on the rich grass that grew near the stream. Cole had built his own small house on the property, close enough to help when needed, far enough away to maintain his independence. But most evenings found him at the main house, sharing dinner with Frank and Mary, teaching Tommy to whittle, and listening to the sounds of a family at peace. The boy had grown stronger and happier, his traumatic memories fading as new, better ones took their place. The town of Millbrook had changed too. With Crenshaw gone, other families had come forward with stories of forged debts and stolen land. Sheriff Morrison, emboldened by Cole's example, had begun investigating the claims and returning property to its rightful owners. The town was healing, just like the Garrett family. On this particular evening, as autumn painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Cole sat on the porch of the main house with Tommy on his lap. The boy was practicing his letters, carefully tracing them in the dirt with a stick. "What's that one?" Cole asked, pointing to a crooked letter. "M," Tommy said proudly. "For Mama." "And that one?" "F for Papa." "And this one?" Tommy grinned up at him. "C for Cole. My Cole." Cole felt his throat tighten with emotion. "That's right, little man. You're Cole." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Frank and Mary joined them on the porch. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the night settle over their land, their home, their family. "You know," Frank said eventually, "I never did thank you properly for what you did." "No need," Cole replied. "You gave me something I didn't even know I was missing." "What's that?" Cole looked down at Tommy, who had fallen asleep against his chest, then at Frank and Mary, who were holding hands and watching their son with infinite tenderness. "A reason to stop running," Cole said simply. And as the night deepened around them, Cole Brennan, the lonely cowboy who had spent 43 years searching for a place to belong, finally understood what it meant to be home. The boy who had been tied to a fence post like an unwanted burden was now surrounded by love and safety. The parents who had been torn apart by greed and violence were together again, stronger than ever. And the man who had saved them all had discovered that sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't facing down a gunfighter in the street. Sometimes it's simply choosing to care. In the distance, a coyote howled at the moon, its voice carrying across the prairie like a song of freedom. But Cole no longer envied its solitude. He had found something better than freedom. He had found family. And for the first time in his life, that was enough. "Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often."